Well, we're going to start the show like we always do. I've got more fraction problems for us to work on. We're going to move to a different topic today. For the last number of weeks, we've worked with fractions. And we're going to start that way as well, adding, in this case, subtracting fractions. However, we're going to move into a topic where we have to multiply and divide fractions. So let's take a look at our first problem. I thought we would end this unit of adding and subtracting fractions with a multiple choice problem. You can't read these answers. Let me see if I can explode this a little bit. There we go. Hopefully that's a little bit better. But one answer is 11 and 7/8. That's 12 and 7/8. That's 12 and 1/8. And that is 11 and 5/8. And you want to decide which, or none of these. Which of these answers is the answer to this difference of these two fractions right here. So we have 12 and 3/4 minus 7/8. Let's take a look at this problem, as we always do, in more than one way. All right, so we've got 12 and 3/4 minus 7/8. As we have continuously mentioned, to subtract or add fractions, you must have a common denominator. You must have a common denominator. So right now we don't. There's 8 and there's 4, and the way you find the common denominator is you take the larger of the denominators and you ask yourself, can 4 divide into the 8 evenly? It can. So that's why 8 is your least common denominator. All right, so we've discussed that a number of times. 8 times what gives you 8? It's 1. So you multiply the 7 by 1 to get 7. 4 times what will give you this 8? And you see that that's 2. So you multiply this 3 by 2 and you get 6. So you have 12 and 6/8 minus 7/8. You get 6/8 minus 7/8. Some of the things that we've talked about over the last number of weeks is the fraction 3/4 in terms of value is the same as 6/8. You have not changed the value of the fraction from 3/4 to 6/8. The only thing that you've done is you've rewritten 3/4 as 6/8 so that you're better able to subtract the 7/8. As we've mentioned, you've got to have a common denominator to subtract fractions. But I'd like you to notice that the numerator in the top fraction is smaller than the numerator in the bottom fraction, meaning you have to adjust that numerator a little bit in order to subtract those numbers. Let's take a quick look. You have to have another way of writing 12 and 6/8. You have to have another way of writing that. Well, what can you do? You can see that another way of saying 12 is 11 plus 1. 11 plus 1 is the same thing as 12. And because you want to rewrite 12 and 6/8, you'd say 11 plus 1 plus 6/8. 11 plus 1 plus 6/8. 11 plus 1 is the same thing as 12, and 6/8 we just brought down. One of the things that we've discussed was another way to say 6/8. Another way to say 1 is 8 over 8. So that's 11 plus 8 over 8, which is 1, plus 6/8. So you add these fractions, which have a common denominator, you end up with 11 and 14/8. So what we can do here is rewrite 12 and 6/8 to be this 11, and 8 plus 16 is 14/8. So what we have here is 11 and 14/8, which is another way to say 12 and 6/8, minus 7/8, which we brought over, and you end up with 11. 14 minus 7, you have the common denominator. 14 minus 7 is 7, and you end up with 11 and 7/8, making A the correct answer to that problem. A is the correct answer to that problem. as we have every week for this program, we are really emphasizing that our students have a mastery level understanding of math. And what that means is to solve the same problem in more than one way. Let's take a look. Let's do that right now. All right, so what we have is we have 12 3/4 minus 7/8. As I've emphasized before, we've got to have more than one way to identify fractions. We have to have more than one way to identify fractions. For this problem here, we identified 12 3/4 as 11 14/8. Another way to identify 12 3/4 instead of 11 14/8 is to have a denominator of 4. You multiply 12 times 4 to get 48. You add the 3 to get 51. Another way to say 12 3/4 is 51/4 minus 7/8. You're going to multiply this by 1. Anytime you multiply something by 1, you don't change the value of what you're multiplying 1 to. So let's take a look at this. Multiplying everything by 1, let's multiply by the least common denominator of 8 over 8. 8 over 8. So what we have now is 51/4 times 8. Let's do that right here. 51/4 times 8. And what I'd like you to do is notice something. I'm going to take a little time with this because, as I told you earlier, we're going to move into a subject where we multiply fractions. We've actually been multiplying fractions for a great deal of time for the duration of this program. But I'm just going to slow down a little bit and show you some of the things that we've been doing pretty much every week for the last 8 weeks. We have been cross-canceling. It's a technique called cross-canceling. And what we can do is observe that the 4 can be divided into the 8. We can divide that. Each of these numbers are divisible by 4, so you turn that to a 1. You turn that to a 2, and you end up with 102. You end up with 102. We had 51 over 4 times 8. All right, so we end up with that being a 2. 51 times 2 is 102. And then we have to take the 8 over 1 times the 7/8. We multiply this 8 here, and now we're multiplying 8 times 7/8, and we end up with, again, we've cross-canceled. Each of these numbers are divisible by 8, so that becomes a 1, and that becomes a 1, and you end up with 1 times 7, which is 7 over 1 times 1. We have 102 minus 7, and then you multiply 8 times a 1, and you get 8. So 102 minus 7 is 95 over 8. 95 over 8. And you end up with how many times you got to simplify this fraction into a mixed number so that you can check against these answers that are offered here. 8 goes into 95. 8 goes into 95 11 times. And then 11 times 8 is 88. If you subtract 95 minus 88, you'll end up with the 7, a remainder of 7. And that's how you end up with 7/8. So we got 7/8. 11 and 7/8 using two completely different techniques.